Welcome. It is the Mend podcast. Joe Roeder here from Red's Fly Shop. Solo today. I tried to twist a few arms to get some guests on the podcast, and everybody had stuff that they had to do. And it was kind of busy around here, but it's just Tuesday's Tippets, and I've been fishing a bunch. So I got some stuff to share with you. Thanks for listening to the podcast. We really, really appreciate it. We really appreciate following the podcast. Follow us on social media. We try to do a good job there. And then YouTube, of course. And this last week, I just put a video on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast, you haven't seen the video, but I did something kind of fun. I can't remember if the comment came from YouTube or the podcast, but it was basically a question like, we see you have a lot of rods rigged up all the time, like in your Suburban in your boat. Like, what are those rods? How do you have them rigged up? Why do you have them? What do you like about them? So I had 7 rods rigged up that I've been using off and on for the last, month or 2 months. And just gave a total rundown, pretty thorough rundown. I think the video is like 11 and a half minutes long, but I gave a couple minutes on each rod and what I like about it. A couple of them I would change things about it. And nobody needs to have 7 rods rigged up. I'll tell you that right now. But our following has a lot of different fisheries. And then within all the different fisheries, I think people have different interests and styles naturally too. So maybe there's a rod in there that you're kind of curious about, or style or strategy you want to know a little bit more about. So that YouTube video went up. That was a good one. And then, man, we got these, I don't know if I mentioned this on the last podcast, so sorry for the redundancy if I did, but we just got about 2 weeks ago an exclusive batch of Watermaster Kodiaks in a gray color. They did that gray color maybe, 15 years ago, and they did one small run and then never did gray again. Anyway, I went over and met with Rich at Watermaster, and we ordered a custom batch of these things. So the only place you can get the gray Kodiaks is at Red's. And there will be a video coming out on YouTube here in the next couple of days where I take that Watermaster out of the box and basically put the whole thing together. It took me casually 16 minutes, I think it was. I'm just going off memory. I think it was 16 minutes. 16 minutes casually, I had the thing ready to fish out of the box. And then went and put a fish in the net. I think I put a fish in the net in like 30 some minutes, 35-ish minutes. I had a fish in the net from the time I opened the box, put the boat together, got my waders on, tied a fly on my rod, caught a fish. So anyway, that's a YouTube video that will be coming out. So a couple of fun things there. And then I guided a few days this last week. Oh, and I fished on Friday for myself, which was outstanding. I got some takeaways from that I'd love to share with you guys. As far as news stuff goes, a couple things. We don't have any ads, but I do want you to shop at Red's naturally. But we're going to be getting more Winston Pure rods. They're building some more for us out of the leftover materials they had from. They kind of did a resurrection of the rod because they had some leftover materials. It's cool. It's a cool story. Rather than waste the materials, the rod was very popular. They built another batch, for us because we had wanted more of them originally. There will be more Winston Pures kind of coming into stock. And then there is a sale on Sage Sonic and Igniter rods right now at Red. So if you're fresh on the podcast, go hit those deals up. They're super duper deals. Next week, November 14th, Fly Fishing Film Tour is coming to the lodge. That's going to be great. We're raising money for Washington Water Trust. And I'll be there. It'll be fun. We always love the film tour. A great opportunity to come fish for the day. Doors open at 4:30, kind of for happy hour prior to the film showing. Whether you live in our area and you can make this event or not, like look for one of the Fly Fishing Film Tours in your area. It's fun. You go there and you BS with anglers. You might bump into people you know. You might bump into people you know there that you didn't even know fly fish. But it's kind of a great, kind of a tribal gathering, those Fly Fishing Film Tours. So we've got that coming up. Fished last week, and I wanted to have them on the podcast, but we ended up fishing like all the way till dusk. And then we went to the bar and had a couple of beers, but fished with Peter Knox, the chief rod engineer and designer at Sage Fly Rods, whom I've known Peter for a long time, and I've cast with him, but never had a chance to fish with him. And gosh, that was a treat. We fished a bunch of jig streamer stuff on mono rigs. Peter doesn't do a lot of that, but he's such a great angler. He picked up a handful of fish on that. And then I just love casting and stripping and dead sticking and just manipulating little jig streamers on mono with an ultralight rod. I talk about it again and again and again. So here you go. There's more talk about jig streamer fishing on mono. Ultralight rods, don't need fly line to cast, but these ultralight rods, you can put that jig streamer in a teacup from 30 feet. Very accurate, a lot of fun. But we did that with Peter a little bit, but the highlight was the blue-winged olive hatch. And it was, just a treat. We had Eric Nickham, who's on the podcast all the time, our travel manager, just a great caster. I'm not too shabby myself. And then Peter is just fundamentally speaking, has one of the tightest, most accurate casts on planet Earth. And it was a lot of fun. This dry fly fishing we've had, I haven't seen a blue-winged olive hatch like this maybe ever on the Acaba River in the canyon here. I mean, we're going on 2 weeks of steady spot and stock dry fly fishing every afternoon. And yesterday was incredible. Yesterday might have been the best day yet. And we're well into November now, which for us is pretty rare. But yeah, Peter, I mean, dead ass accuracy. He could put that, little 18 comparadun that he's fishing. He could just drop that, in a lane that's 2 or 3 inches wide from 40 feet. And I don't know how many times he would pick up a fish on the first cast that would take me 6. So it was a little humbling, because if you watch the two of us cast, you would probably look fairly similar, maybe did a little slightly different style, but just that type of precision, it was really nice to watch, because the average angler we get is not a very good dry fly angler. We just nymph fish too much, just plain and simple, just because that's what the river will give us kind of on a daily basis. But the difference was we could go pick off a couple of really nice fish out of a pod. And after we hooked a couple, we might put the pod down, but we could just move to the next pod really quickly and efficiently. So the number of fish and the number of opportunities you could stack up is just much more efficient, because that hatch might only last maybe 2 hours of good rising, sometimes 3 or 4, but sometimes only 45 minutes or an hour. But gosh, we could move through those fish so quick. And we had 18-inch fish in 10 inches of water, in 10 inches of glassy water, where you could just see that fish yawn back, open its mouth, gently sip. And then we'd try to pick out, what we thought was the best fish in the group, and just target that fish on, 12-foot leaders, 6X tippet, ultralight rods. Oh, and I put this on Instagram, but I realized that that's not the center of the universe. So if you're listening to the podcast, you might not be on Instagram. God bless you. But I fished it was the 25th anniversary, and I have a rod, a Sage SLT. I think it stood for super light taper, in an 8-foot 9-inch 3-weight that I bought my first or second guide season, but it's the 25th anniversary. I've had the rod 25 years, and that rod is just remarkable still to this day. And so I keep it in the tube. I don't put it together till I'm going to use it. I take really good care of that rod, and I take it out on special occasions. And fishing with Peter on Friday was a special occasion, so I brought out one of my vintage Sage rods. And when at Sage in the old days, when you would order a rod, and I think they'll probably still do it, but they put your name on the rod. They would have their best kind of artist, write the guide's name on the rod, and then you had your name on your rod. And I've got an X with my name on it, my SLT with my name on it. I've got an old Spey rod with my name on it. And I've got, I think, a Sage VPS with my name on it. So I've got a whole locker full of these really cool kind of vintage Sage fly rods that still cast amazingly well. I mean, you put nice fresh line on them and they just come to life. But fished my old Sage SLT, which was great. Love that rod. But I did fish it up against kind of the newest Sage dry fly rod, their R8 Classic. And it is a pretty remarkable difference what has happened over the last 25 years just with design and materials. But I still love that old rod. So that was pretty fun, fishing that. And I will say, like, one thing that I'm constantly learning, and I've been out guiding quite a bit, since Friday. I've got quite a few days in this week, but it was just having a couple of different dry flies based on lighting conditions. There was we were up against different lighting conditions, and Peter fished, I think, pretty much exclusively a comparadun. I really like this fly called the Performance Enhancing Dun, which is a CDC wing, but there was certain light, even with the pink indicator dot on top of that performance enhancing done, you just couldn't see it. So we fished, went through a litany of different flies just based on lighting, because sometimes we'd be casting into the flat light, sometimes we'd be casting in a really good dark, dark backdrop where there was a mountain, casting a reflection, and those areas much easier to see the fly. But we changed flies a bit, not based on fish preference, but based on just, could we see the fly amongst all the other duns out there? Because if you can't see your fly, you don't really know when to set the hook. And if you start setting the hook on eats that are just near your fly, you're gonna spook these groups of fish. I mean, these fish were so hypersensitive. If you made waves with the boat, if you dropped the anchor too loud, if you set the hook near the fish, they would change their feeding behavior immediately. So we want to make sure we could see our fly, not only so we could track the drift, but because you can't just be setting the hook on mysterious rises. So if you've been fishing dry flies and then just setting the hook, when a suspicious rise somewhat near your fly happens, you're making it more challenging for yourself. And I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. Again, week to week, and these podcasts kind of morph into one another. But a couple weeks ago, there was just a few caddis on the water, not very many, like very, very few. They were pretty small. They were about a 16, but I ran a size 16 tan X caddis, even amongst the blue wing hatch, because we could track it and see it. And that proved to be an enormous advantage. The fish seemed to prefer the caddis, but we could track it really, really well. And so we weren't setting the hook on any false positives, where a fish would eat, 6 or 12 inches from our fly, and we set the hook and we spook the fish. And then the other, there's a lot of tips that I have, but the other thing that after all this, I mean, this is the most small technical dry fly fishing done the last 2 weeks. I've done more, itty bitty 6X dry fly fishing in the last 2 weeks than I've done in the last 2 years. I mean, it's been every single day we've been able to get on really good feeding fish. But if you're upstream of the fish, and, that's how we prefer to present a fly when we're in a boat, on, on the bank. If we're doing a ground assault, we can cast back up on the fish, which is great. Much easier to hook the fish and get a positive connection. But when you're upstream of the fish, you have to be very slow with your hook set. You have to let that fish close its mouth. The hook is so small, you have to have that fish's mouth completely closed. And I like to just be very slow on the hook set so that my tippet drifts into the corner of the fish's mouth and the tippet essentially gets caught. And then my hook set is a very gentle rod lift where I'm letting that tippet track through the corner of the fish's mouth until that little itty bitty hook finds a connection. And so very slow, lazy hook sets. I was guiding a guy from Texas yesterday, and he's good stick. Very cool dude, artist by the name of David Bates. You can look him up, check out his paintings. They're amazing. But yeah, David was just on it. He's good stick, very quick. And man, I don't know, we must have missed the first 10 fish until I finally got him to throttle back. And I actually, fished a little bit with him. He was by himself. And so he invited me to throw some casts as well and try to pick off some of these more difficult fish. And once he saw my hook set and that it wasn't even really a hook set, he was like, oh, okay, got it. And then we went on just a rampage, hooking a great number of fish after that. But the other thing about that subtle lift is you're not going to scare that fish either, because when we get into these groups of fish, we're trying really hard to target just one individual fish. And the fish that you choose to cast at might be the one that's in the most amenable holding lie for a drift. It might be the easiest fish to catch. It might be the closest fish. It might be the fish that's the most downstream and out from the pod so that you can pick it off without that fish thrashing through the pod of fish. Or it might be the biggest fish, and that's kind of where we wound up yesterday, was really just trying to move downstream and then target, what we felt were the more mature trout. You can't catch them all. It's a short, the hatch is a relatively short window. So you got to be diligent about, moving and grabbing a new target, every several minutes. But yeah, it could be any one of those. But that really, really slow hook set is going to not spook fish with a size 18 or 20, depending on what we're throwing. It definitely yields a higher conversion rate. So yeah, the dry fly fishings continue to be good. Ultralight rods, have been very, very important this week. 3s and 4s, something that you can mend and feed line without bumping the fly, something with a lot of flex, more of a medium action style rod, your R8 Classics, any number of, Winston Pure series, any number of really, medium action rods that, enough energy to make a good loop and cast accurate, but soft enough that you can actually get that fly line to feed out and move and mend without boogieing your fly up or messing up your drift. So yeah, that was a lot of good dry fly fishing. Learned a ton. Hopefully those couple of tips help you if you're able to get out on a river near you soon. And then the other thing is worms, man. So I just posted an Instagram video just talking about worms a little bit. The problem with worms, like I will fish worms, right? It's a bug like everything else. It's natural trout food. You're matching the hatch. Got no problem fishing worms. I'll fish silicone, I'll fish yarn, whatever. We tried a bunch of worms that my guest had yesterday, and the one that wound up working was the silicone style worm, but he had some really cool leather worms that they fish on other rivers and on the San Juan. And I wish that I'd tried some of those leather worms, and I may dabble with that a little bit in some chamois worms as well. But I haven't dabbled much with leather or chamois, but I would like to. But what I'll say about worms is I meet anglers all the time. Some of them will work for us. That the worm is kind of their go-to. Like they will put that on first all the time because trout like worms, right? And it's hard to mistake a worm for anything else. It doesn't, a bright pink or red worm doesn't look like organic debris, a piece of moss or a stick or a twig tumbling downstream. Worm is easy for the trout to identify. If you're not currently fishing any worms at all, you should be. You should be experimenting with them. But what I find is anglers will get very one-dimensional and they'll tie a worm on and become extremely reliant on a very narrow group of flies. Now, I'm not suggesting you need to have 100 different nymphs and fish them all equally. That's ridiculous. I think people should understand the flies that they have. When do they work? How fast do they sink? In what conditions have I had success? You need to have a narrow enough fly selection. Understand your flies. But when you become one-dimensional like that, whether it's a patstone or a San Juan worm or whatever it happens to be, I think you're held hostage to not being very curious or creative. And you need to be curious and creative. But the thing about worms is don't get hooked on them. They can be a bit addictive, especially after you've had a little bit of success with them. But I was out for, must have been yesterday. It was day before yesterday. Day before yesterday, I was out for just going for a morning run, and there was a little drizzle, and I was literally just hopping over worms on the road and sidewalk all over the place. The worms were on the move, and it doesn't happen every single time you get a little bit of moisture. But for whatever reason, a couple days ago, like the worms were just absolutely everywhere. And so put the boat in the water, the river had come up just a little bit, and it was like, hey, you know what? We'll probably start with a worm. Start with a worm on, and I'm a big single fly fan. So I was guiding, running New Zealand style indicator rigs. I have really gone back to that traditional New Zealand style indicator setup for a couple of reasons. I need to do like a long form YouTube on the traditional New Zealand style rig because I was in it for a while. I went back to tying yarn in, which works pretty well in the spring and summer. But then when we get these colder water conditions, the depth can matter a lot more because the fish aren't moving quite as far to get the fly. They seem to have just a smaller strike zone. But I rigged up 2 rods, New Zealand style indicator rigs, very simple leader system. I ran about 5 feet of 20-pound Maxima for a butt section, tied in my New Zealand rig, and then 4.5X fluorocarbon down to a single fly. And I'm a big single fly fan. I think it's better for the fishery. If we all fish single flies, I think we'd all be a lot better off. Just no foul hooking, decreases handling time, it's a cleaner presentation, and then I'm not polluting the water as bad for the next angler coming through. I'm throwing less junk at them. So you're welcome. If you're fishing behind me, I'm generally fishing just a single nymph rig. Anywho, ran that setup, 1 stonefly nymph, 1 San Juan worm, wiggly worm from Fulling Mills, size 10, just enough weight to get it down. I tend to fish as light as possible and then go heavier or deeper if I need to. So I'm kind of a short and light guy. And almost immediately we had a couple of takedowns and the guys are, I fish with these guys a lot. They're like, "Are you sure those are fish?" I'm like, "I am 1000% sure those are fish." We went through the hole a couple times and then went back through and then followed up on every one of those takes. And I gave them a break for a minute and went back through. And it was a really good worm game. I mean, I think the worm was probably hooking about 2-to-1 over that stonefly nymph. And stonefly nymphs will get active as well after a rain and dark sky. Stoneflies are generally at their lowest point of activity in the fall, the bigger stonefly nymphs. But that rain and that changing velocity of the river will get those stonefly nymphs out on the hunt and get them out from the undersides of the rocks. But yeah, the worm was incredibly effective. And we caught a couple of really, really nice fish on that worm. And I had been fishing worms off and on leading up to that little moisture event, and very mediocre success. I would just kind of experiment with them here and there. But it was very apparent that the day that the worms were all over the sidewalks, all over the road, there was a very good worm bite. So I think it's important to take advantage of it. And then if you follow us on Instagram, you can see this visually. But today, what's it, November 5th? Yeah, November 5th. I post a video so you can see this visually if you want to, like, a reference point. But I talk a little bit about worms and the upside of like a silicone-based worm. And there's tons of them. You call them squirmy wormies. Fulling Mill happens to make one called a wiggly worm that we sell that I really like. But the problem's kind of the same amongst most of all the silicone-based worms, and that is they're just not very durable. You catch a few trout on them, and they get torn up. They're pretty soft. They're really flexible. That's what makes them really attractive to the fish. They move a lot, but they're not very durable. And so you pay a couple bucks. I don't know how much those cost. $2, $2.50 or something like that. Catch a couple fish on them and they get torn up pretty quick. So a couple tips: when you're unhooking fish with one of those silicone-based squirmy style worms, make sure your barb is absolutely pinched flush. You should do that anyways, but it will save you money, because that if you net the fish and then let the fish kind of swim around in the net or shake around in the net a little bit, a lot of times they'll come off themselves, and then you don't damage the worm by physically having to pinch it and remove it. And I would try to avoid using hemostats with any type of squirmy material, and because you'll tear up the fly. So make it super barbless. Try to be really gentle when you're removing that hook from the fish. Both for the trout's sake and also for your sake. And a single fly rig, if you're running one of those beaded squirmy wormies, is great, because then it's just easier to get the fish unhooked and you'll save your fly. But if I establish that I've got a really good worm bite and I'm tired of tearing these worms up, go back to like the old school vernile or ultra micro chenille. There's a couple names for it. We sell a variety of those materials, and you can go to the yarn style, which is way more durable, way more cost effective. You can catch a lot of fish on those yarn traditional San Juan worms compared to like the silicone style. So it's good to have both, but for durability and cost effectiveness, if you're buying your own flies, strongly recommend that. The other thing is, if you're looking to make like worms, more cost effective, because they do kind of get trashed. I was just in that Instagram video, I mentioned this, but so I'll mention it again. But if you want a visual of what this stuff looks like, it's just called squirmy material from Montana Fly Company that we sell. A bunch of different colors of it. But for $7, God, you could probably tie, I don't know, damn near 100 worms with this for $7. Then you just need a hook and or bead and some thread. It's a pretty casual entry point in fly tying if you're serious about fishing and you want to get some worms that are the right weights, the right colors, and things like that. Just get a bunch of that squirmy material. And there's a bazillion videos on how to tie those things. You just got to be careful with your thread wraps that you don't cut that squirmy material in half, because that thread will cut that squirmy material. And there's some really easy ways. This winter, I'm going to participate a lot more in the fly tying on YouTube, but there are some really easy, like literally I can tie them in 30 to 45 seconds. And the most important part of that equation in tying those squirmies is just making sure that you have a really good quality hook. And if you're going to run a bead, a good quality bead as well. But yeah, that's another option to try to make that worm fishing a little bit more cost effective. Streamer fishing this week has been pretty quiet. We did get the hat trick yesterday, or the trifecta. Did get my guest into, we did it last 2 days, got fish on nymphs, dries, and streamers. And so that's always kind of cool to mix things up. And it helps to have a couple of rods rigged up so you don't have to break rods down to swap strategies as well. But we did end up landing a really good one after the hatch last night, throwing streamers. And the streamer rig that I'm running a lot, just because it's really versatile, is that there's a line, the Rio Elite or the Rio Premier, it doesn't matter, the Gold Max. And that Gold Max line is really kind of an indicator slash nymphing line. It's got a really kind of heavy back taper on it for good mending, and then turning over kind of some heavy loads on the front end of the rig. But you can mend it, you can roll cast it really well. And what I've been doing is taking a 10-foot poly leader. Rio makes a big variety of these things, but you can get them that sink anywhere from 3 to 6 inches, or I think 7 inches per second. And I just looped a sinking poly leader on the end of that Rio Gold Max, run about 4 feet of 2X fluoro. And basically I've got my own sink tip rig, and I can swing that like a traditional wet fly style swing. So a little bit like a spay fisherman, cast it out in the current, give it a min, let it sink, and then let it tighten and rise. And I've been doing, I think, better on the single hander than the spay. It's not uncommon, because with the single hander, I think people tend to do a lot more of the fishy stuff. You probably relate to this. Like, you need to slow the fly down. You need to high stick it a little bit before you let it drop and swing. You can jig it a little bit better. You can cast and strip it if you wind up in a big eddy. And by the way, that is one thing on this podcast I always want to try to help you have. If you're fishing on rivers that are also guided, I always want to give you kind of some advice on how to kind of compete is the right word, but kind of how to fish differently than like guide boats that are out there. And one of them is, one thing that we don't do very often as guides is just going to some of the big deep holes in the back eddies, from now through spring, and just fishing sink tip lines through those really slow, slewy back eddies. That can be a really great way to pick up some really big fish that are much more aggressive, because they're just not getting targeted in a lot of that really slow kind of soupy water. Most of the time we're running drifts, in traditional current lines and big seams and things, especially if we have 2 anglers in the boat. It's just a very efficient way to, and fun way to fish. But you can go into some of those big deep holes and throw sink tip lines and do pretty well. And you're targeting some fish in a manner that they probably don't get targeted all that often. So that's a good way to go if you got a sink tip line. And I think, starting about mid-October through, mid-March, having a sink tip is a huge advantage. We do a lot of floating line streamer fishing as well, but I think the sink tip, for being able to just move it low and slow, and then a moderately weighted fly, not your giant cone head streamers, will kind of slither over the boulders and over the ledges. You'll be a little bit less snaggy, and it also undulates and moves a little bit. I think we've mentioned that in the past, but yeah, sink tip line is great. Streamer fishing's been a little slower, I think, primarily because the blue wing olive hatch has been so good in the afternoon. And frankly, the traditional nymphing, outside, kind of the worm event that I had the other day, the traditional nymphing has been a little bit slower as well, because a lot of these fish, at least here, I'm sure it's true on many rivers, are sitting out in kind of some quirky water. They're out in the glassy flats, they're in the tail outs, they're in the really weak edges. They're not holding in just kind of the obvious, feed me spots like they are in a little bit higher water. So there's a lot of food in the river, and those fish can kind of sit back in some of those glassy edges and be really safe, because they can see the environment around them really well. They can sense when they're being cast at. And so I've been trying to figure out how to target more of those fish pre-hatch and post-hatch. And I haven't really got it figured out, but I have been throwing like post-hatch if we're fishing out of a boat on the move. For those of you that do boat fish, throwing a really little streamer on a long leader and a floating line up into those really weak edges. And if you believe it'll work and you stick with it, you can pluck out some really, really exceptional fish out of some quirky water that is just too glassy and thin to throw a strike indicator rig into and have any hopes of catching a fish. So yeah, some of these fish are sitting in some odd water. And if you do get an opportunity to fish a hatch like this, regardless of what river you're on, I think before I wrap up here, I think one tip would be to watch where those fish are feeding. Watch where the highest densities of fish are. Watch where these pods of fish are, because those same spots, the same seam lines, those same rock piles, those fish are going to probably just kind of move just a little ways, kind of back into those adjacent pools and seams in that adjacent holding water near where you saw them feeding on dry. So I can remember distinctly, my first handful of guide season when I was still learning every day, but I would be able to kind of identify where the densities of trout were living based on the feeding activity during the hatch. If an area was just dead during a hatch and they were feeding everywhere else, even if the water might look really good, for whatever reason, there just might not be a good population of fish living on that seam line or that hole, or maybe that riffle was just kind of dead at that time or that season. And we see that from season to season. Sometimes there are certain riffles that are just full of trout one year and then just not very many the next. So yeah, use that hatch opportunity to start kind of landmarking where densities of fish live as well. Because I've just in the last 10 days or so, I've marked a whole bunch of fish that I'm like, man, I didn't realize there were this many big fish living in this zone right here. So after this hatch goes away, it'll be done here in a week. It'll get cold on us, but now I've got kind of some intel that I can approach some of that water that maybe I was overlooking or not fishing correctly in the past. So yeah, use that feeding activity to mark some pods of fish. Yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up with that. Just kind of a short Tuesday's Tippets today. Yeah, just go check out some of the information that I pointed out, some of the little Instagram videos if you want kind of more embellishment on some of the things I mentioned. And then, that Watermaster that I was talking about, I cannot say enough great things about Watermasters. And if you're a solo angler or you fish by yourself a lot, I mean, I would be looking really serious at that Watermaster. And the Gray Watermasters, the exclusive ones, when they're gone, they're gone. It took 10 months or more to get those built. So it's not something you can just kind of order here and there. So if you're looking for kind of just a different look, everybody's got a green Watermaster Kodiak. If you're looking for the gray one, while supplies last, you can buy them just exclusively here at Reds. Anyway, thanks for listening. Promise to go fishing this week. I will report back next week.